My father kept a spreadsheet for everything: grocery lists, home repair schedules, the mileage on every car we ever owned. He tracked my brother's soccer stats from age 6 through high school. He tracked the returns on his investment accounts going back 20 years. The man had a system for everything, and for most of my childhood, I found it comforting. Order meant safety. Predictability meant nobody would get hurt. What I didn't understand until much later was that my brother Wesley had learned to work that system like a lockpick. My name is Audrey. I'm 31 years old, and for most of my 20s, I believed that the hollow feeling in my chest whenever I came home for the holidays was just anxiety, normal family stuff, the kind of tension everyone has, but nobody talks about at Thanksgiving. I told my therapist that. I told my friends that. I even told myself that for longer than I should have. It took a forged signature, a shattered retirement account, and a county courthouse in rural Ohio to teach me the difference between family tension and something much darker. My father built his landscaping business from a truck and a push mower. By the time I was in middle school, he had 12 employees and a contract with 3 commercial properties. By the time I graduated college, the business was worth something real. Not rich people money, but the kind of money that changes what's possible for a family. Retirement without fear. A cushion. Options. Dad always said he wanted to split things evenly when the time came. Me and Wesley, 50-50. He said it so often it became background noise, the kind of promise you stop really hearing because it's always been true and you assume it always will be. I moved to Cincinnati for work at 23. Marketing coordinator at a mid-size firm. Nothing glamorous, but I loved the independence. I had my own apartment, a cat named after a poet, a routine that was entirely mine. I came home to my parents' house in Dayton 4 or 5 times a year. Christmas, Easter, Dad's birthday, Mom's birthday if she reminded me enough times. Wesley never moved out. He stayed in Dayton, worked part-time at a hardware store, and somewhere along the way started helping Dad with the business bookkeeping. That should have been my first signal. Wesley had never shown interest in the business before. He barely showed interest in holding a job longer than 8 months. But suddenly, he was Dad's right hand, the son who was always there, the one who understood what it took to keep things running. Dad lit up when he talked about it. I was happy for him. Genuinely. I didn't see the architecture of what was being built around me. The first thing I noticed was small. Dad called me on a Tuesday in February, which was unusual. We were more of a Sunday afternoon family. He sounded distracted, like he was reading something while talking to me. He mentioned Wesley had been helping him restructure some accounts for tax purposes. He used that phrase exactly, restructure some accounts. I asked what that meant, and he said Wesley had explained it all, and it made sense, and the accountant had signed off. I asked which accountant. He said, a new one. Wesley had recommended him. I said okay. I went back to my evening. I made dinner. I did not think about it again for 4 months, which is one of the things I've had to forgive myself for. The second thing was less small. Mom called me in June crying, which she almost never did. She said she found a letter from Dad's brokerage and the account balance was wrong. I asked how wrong. She said she didn't know. She couldn't tell. The statements were confusing, and Wesley had been handling all the paperwork. When I asked to look at the statements, Wesley got on the phone. He was calm in that particular way he had. Not reassuring, just smooth. He said Mom was confused, that everything had been consolidated for simplicity, that he'd walk her through it this weekend. I drove to Dayton that Saturday. Wesley wasn't there when I arrived. He texted Mom that morning saying he had a work thing. Mom handed me a manila folder of statements and then went to sit in the garden because looking at numbers made her head hurt. I sat at my parents' kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside me, and I read through 3 years of account activity. It took me 40 minutes to understand what I was seeing. It took me another 20 to stop shaking enough to think clearly. Wesley had been making transfers. Small ones at first, $800 here, $1,200 there, always framed in the memo lines as business operational expenses or equipment maintenance, then larger ones, a $14,000 transfer to an LLC I'd never heard of. Another for $9,500. The LLC's name was close enough to Dad's company name that you'd miss it if you weren't looking carefully. 1 letter different. The kind of thing that slides past you when you trust the person handling the paperwork. Over 3 years, he had moved just over $212,000 out of my father's accounts. I called my father's original accountant, the one he'd had for 15 years before Wesley's new guy came along. She remembered Dad well. She said she'd been let go 2.5 years ago, that Dad had called her personally to say he was going in a different direction. She'd been surprised because they'd had a good relationship. She asked if everything was okay. I told her I wasn't sure yet. I called a friend from college who worked at a law firm. Not a financial attorney, she did family law, but she listened to everything I said, and then she gave me the name of someone who specialized in exactly this kind of situation. I did not call Wesley. I did not tell Mom yet. I did not tell Dad yet, because Dad had had a mild cardiac event 8 months earlier, and his doctor had been clear that stress was a serious concern. I sat with this information alone for 6 days, which were the longest 6 days of my adult life. I went to work. I answered emails. I went to the gym 3 times because I had to do something with what was living in my body. On the 7th day, I met with the attorney. Her name was Constance, and she had the kind of stillness that made you feel like she had seen everything and could not be surprised by any of it. I laid out everything I had: the statements, the LLC name, the memo lines, the timeline. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked me 3 questions. Did my father have any documentation of authorizing these transfers? Did I have access to the business email accounts? Was my brother's name on any of the accounts as an authorized signatory? The answers were, I didn't know, possibly, and yes, Dad had added him when he started helping with bookkeeping 18 months before the transfers began. Constance told me that being an authorized signatory did not mean he was authorized to transfer funds for personal benefit. She told me what we were looking at had a name: financial elder abuse, combined with potential fraud given the LLC structure. She told me the next step was a forensic accountant to document everything formally. She also told me something I hadn't thought of yet. She said, the fact that he created a shell LLC tells us he understood what he was doing was wrong. People who make honest bookkeeping mistakes don't incorporate shadow companies. I went to my car and sat there for a while before I could drive. It took 2 months to build the full picture. The forensic accountant was meticulous. She traced every transfer, cross-referenced the LLC filings, and found something we hadn't expected. Wesley had co-signed a lease on a condo using the LLC, and the condo was not in Dayton. It was in Scottsdale, Arizona. He'd never mentioned it, as far as my parents knew. He was living in their basement to help around the house. He had a whole life they didn't know about. During those 2 months, I called home every Sunday like normal. I made small talk with Mom about her garden. I listened to Dad talk about a new mowing contract he'd just landed. I watched Wesley's name come up in conversation. Wesley fixed the garage door. Wesley thinks we should repaint the trim. Wesley is coming for dinner Sunday. And I smiled and said that's nice, and felt something cold and steady settle in behind my sternum. I think what I felt was clarity. Not anger, exactly. Anger came later in waves. What I felt in those weeks was something closer to a door closing in my mind. The door that had always let me explain Wesley away, reframe his behavior, choose the generous interpretation. That door had closed. I wasn't going to open it again. My attorney filed a civil complaint in late October. Wesley was served on a Thursday. Mom called me that evening, and she was not crying. Her voice had that particular flatness it gets when she's moved past crying into something harder. She said, Audrey, do you know anything about this? I said yes. I said I'd been working on it for 2 months. I said I was sorry I hadn't told her sooner, but I needed everything documented before I could bring it to the family, because I was worried about how Dad's health might be affected. There was a long silence. She said, how much? I said, $212,000. Another silence, longer this time. She said, he was here for dinner on Sunday. I know, Mom. He helped your father with his blood pressure medication. I know. She didn't say anything else for almost a minute. Then she said, I want to see everything. Send me everything. And then she hung up. My mother is 64 years old, and she's never once raised her voice at me or my brother. She spent 30 years building a quiet life with a man she loved and trusting that the people she loved were worthy of that trust. I thought about that a lot during the weeks that followed. Wesley retained an attorney and denied everything. His initial position was that the transfers were authorized. verbal authorizations from Dad for business expenses. His attorney sent a letter suggesting that any accounting irregularities were the result of bookkeeping errors and that my complaint was motivated by sibling rivalry and financial jealousy. That phrase, financial jealousy, I kept coming back to it. I turned it over in my mind like a stone. I had a salary job. I had my own 401k. I had never asked my parents for a cent since I left for college. Wesley had lived in their basement for 4 years while apparently funding a life in Arizona, and I was the jealous one. I want to be honest about something. There's a period during all of this when I doubted myself. When the version Wesley's attorney was selling, confused daughter, family miscommunication, innocent mistakes, almost found purchase in me, because I'd spent my whole life being told that Wesley's failures were circumstances and my successes were luck. That framework had roots. Pulling it out took work. What helped was the paperwork. Paperwork does not have feelings. Paperwork does not benefit from the generous interpretation. The forensic accountant's report was 47 pages long, and every page said the same thing in a different way. This was intentional, systematic, and ongoing. The deposition was in February. Wesley walked in with his attorney and sat across a conference table from me and Constance, and it was the first time I'd seen him since before I filed. He'd lost weight. His left knee bounced under the table throughout the entire session. He wouldn't look at me directly, just slightly past my left ear, like I was a bright light he couldn't quite face. Constance had prepared me for what to expect, but nothing really prepares you for sitting across from your brother while an attorney reads your father's financial records aloud and asks him to explain each line. His answers were a kind of art form and non-answers. To his recollection, he believed at the time, he may have misunderstood the parameters of his authorization. He was doing his best to manage a complicated situation. Then Constance placed a document on the table. The LLC incorporation papers, dated 14 months before the first transfer. Wesley's signature, Wesley's address, Wesley's registered agent. She asked him to explain why, if the transfers were legitimate business expenses, they were routed through a personally held LLC rather than paid directly to vendors. He said he'd have to consult with his accountant. She asked him for the name of his accountant. He gave a name. She said, "Interesting, because that individual's license was revoked in 2021. Could he explain how he came to retain someone whose credentials he apparently hadn't verified?" His knee stopped bouncing. She placed another document on the table, the Scottsdale condo lease. She asked him to confirm his signature. He confirmed it. She asked him to explain how he had funded the lease deposit of $18,500 in March of the previous year, given that his reported income for that quarter was $6,200. His attorney leaned over and whispered something. Wesley said he'd like to take a break. Constance said, of course, they could take a break. She just wanted to note for the record that they hadn't yet reached the section on the wire transfers to a second LLC she'd recently identified. This one registered in Nevada 18 months after the first one. The break lasted 22 minutes. When they came back in, Wesley's attorney asked to discuss a potential resolution. The settlement negotiation took 6 weeks. Wesley's position, to his attorney, was that he was willing to repay some portion of the funds, but disputed the full amount. He claimed certain transfers were legitimately authorized even if the documentation was incomplete. He wanted a confidentiality clause. He wanted the complaint withdrawn with prejudice so it couldn't be reopened. Constance said no to the confidentiality clause. She said what my client wants is full restitution, a formal acknowledgement in writing that these funds were taken without authorization, and a permanent removal from any role connected to her parents' finances, accounts, or estate documents. She also mentioned almost conversationally that nothing in the civil settlement would preclude a referral to the county prosecutor's office and that financial elder abuse in Ohio was a felony. She said we had not yet decided whether to pursue that avenue, but that decision remained open. I watched Wesley's attorney write something on his notepad. We reached a settlement that covered the full $212,000 plus legal costs. There was a payment schedule because Wesley had spent most of it, the condo, a car, what appeared to be a fairly sustained attempt to build a lifestyle he couldn't afford. The acknowledgement went into writing. He was removed from every account and document connected to my parents. The judge reviewed the settlement, asked my father several questions to confirm he understood the terms, and approved it. When it was over, Wesley stood up, put on his coat, and walked out without looking at any of us. His attorney shook Constance's hand. "I want to tell you about my father in that courtroom because I think about it more than I think about anything else from that day. He is 66 years old, and he has spent 40 years building something. He built it with his hands and his schedule and his spreadsheets and his system for every small thing because he understood that small things done consistently are what large things are actually made of. He sat in that courtroom in his good blazer, the one he wears to church and to client meetings and to anything that matters, and he listened to a judge describe what his son had done. His face didn't break. He just got very still. On the drive home, I sat in the back seat with him while Mom drove. He looked out the window at the flat Ohio fields going past. After a while, he said, "I should have looked more carefully." I said, "Dad, he made it so you didn't have to look." He nodded. He kept looking out the window. I didn't tell him that looking more carefully wouldn't have helped, because Wesley had built the whole system on the assumption that Dad trusted him. That's what made it possible. Not my father's negligence, his love. Here's what I know now that I wish I'd known earlier. Authorized signatory does not mean authorized to do anything. Verbal authorization is almost impossible to prove and very easy to claim. A new accountant who comes recommended by the person being overseen is not an independent check. Small, regular transfers that fit under a pattern are harder to notice than one large transfer. And the person in a family who volunteers to handle the paperwork, especially financial paperwork, especially when an older parent is involved, deserves a second look. Not because family is inherently predatory, but because that position requires trust, and trust without verification is just hope. I'm not a suspicious person by nature. I don't want to be. But I've learned the difference between trust and willful blindness, and I've learned it in a way I won't forget. My parents are rebuilding. The payment schedule is holding so far. Mom has a new accountant, one she chose herself. With references she verified herself. Dad still keeps his spreadsheets. He added a new one. I call home every Sunday. Wesley doesn't come to the house anymore. Mom hasn't spoken to him since February. I don't know if that will ever change, and I've had to make peace with the fact that it's not mine to decide. Some doors close quietly. Some close like a verdict. What I know is that I can breathe again. Not because the money came back. Money is money, and some of what was lost can't be recovered in a settlement. I can breathe because I stopped waiting for someone else to name what was happening. I stopped giving the benefit of the doubt to a version of my brother that hadn't existed in a very long time. That's the part they don't tell you about growing up in a family like mine. The harm isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's a memo line on a transfer. Sometimes it's a signature on a lease in a city no one knew about. Sometimes it's the slow, careful work of making yourself indispensable to someone who loves you and then using that love like a key. I found the lock. I changed it. And for the first time in years, what's mine is actually mine. People ask me sometimes how I knew something was wrong before I could prove it. And honestly, I'm not sure I did know. Not in any clean, certain way. It was more like a sound you can't quite locate. Something slightly off in a house you've lived in your whole life. You keep walking through the rooms trying to find the source, and everyone around you says they don't hear anything, and after a while, you start to wonder if you're the problem. That's what Wesley counted on, not just my parents' trust, but my own uncertainty about myself. What I've come to understand is that people who take from others this way, quietly, systematically, over years, they're not operating on impulse, they're operating on a calculation. And part of that calculation is always who will look and who will look away. Wesley knew our family. He knew Dad trusted numbers but hated conflict. He knew Mom believed that love meant extending grace indefinitely. He knew I lived 2 hours away and visited 4 times a year. He built his entire plan around what we each would and wouldn't do. That's not bad luck. That's a choice, made again and again every time he moved money, every time he filed a document with a name 1 letter off from our father's company, every time he sat at the dinner table and let Mom talk about how grateful she was to have him close. Every one of those moments was a decision. And every decision has a weight to it that accumulates over time, whether you're aware of it or not. By the time Constance placed that condo lease on the table, the weight had been accumulating for 3 years. Wesley had spent that time building a version of himself that the evidence no longer supported, and when reality and the version collide, in a room with a judge and a forensic accountant's 47-page report, there's nowhere left to stand. I don't think the lesson of what happened to my family is that you shouldn't trust people. I think it's that trust is not the same thing as abdication. My father trusted Wesley, and that trust was real, and it was earned once, but it wasn't maintained with any verification, any check, any second look. Loving someone doesn't mean outsourcing your judgment about them entirely. It means staying engaged, staying curious, asking the small questions before they become large ones. What I keep coming back to is the attorney's line about the LLC. She said people who make honest mistakes don't incorporate shadow companies. Intelligence without integrity doesn't protect you. It just makes the harm more efficient. Wesley was smart. He was organized. He understood exactly how the systems worked, and he used that understanding to route around every safeguard my father had trusted him to maintain. Audrey, I had to decide at some point to stop being afraid of what I might find. That was the hardest part. Not the paperwork, not the deposition, not even telling my parents. It was the moment in my car outside the attorney's office when I understood that knowing the truth was going to cost something, and I decided to pay it anyway. That decision, I think, is what integrity actually looks like when it's not abstract. It's not a value you hold in easy moments. It's what you do in the parking lot when you're shaking and you could still turn around and choose not to know. I chose to know. Everything else followed from that.